Hey folks, I'm Kurt Navina, and for today's very special Play for All interview, we are joined with Emily Grace Buck, who is a narrative designer who's worked on Telltale games like Batman, Guardians of the Galaxy, and The Walking Dead. Emily, thank you for being here. It's an honor you're here.
Thank you, Kurt. I'm so happy to be here today. This is great.
We're here to talk about the Waylanders, a party-based, narrative-driven RPG. So Emily, give us the rundown. What is the Waylanders?
Great. So the Waylanders is a tactical RPG set in ancient Ireland and Spain that follows history and legends of the Celts, a lot of which many people might not be very familiar with. It is a party-based RPG. There is romance. There are plenty of fun conversations with all of the party members. There is monsters that you've never seen before. It should be a really great time. I'm really happy to be working on it because we're showing a slice of history that most people might not be familiar with. Some of the races in the game include Mauryans, Fomorians, a different version of werewolves than most people have seen. So it's not your typical fantasy races out of Tolkien. We don't have any elves. We don't have any dwarves. Sorry to everybody who likes elves and dwarves, but we're doing some fun and different stuff with this one.
That's fun. Also, gone with them.
Also to be noted is we wrote it in a little bit more of a modern voice. So it's a fantasy epic RPG set in Celtic time, but a lot of the humor is a little bit more modern. So I hope people will have fun playing that.
So you touched on a lot in that I'm curious about. First off, that's great. It's a relief that we're getting a different side of fantasy, especially in an RPG. And also, you said different kinds of werewolves, and I want to come back to that because werewolves don't get the love that they deserve. You've had a past in doing very narrative focused games that usually the sole mechanic is to push the story along by your choice. So this, in a lot of ways, sounds like a change of pace. And one thing I'm curious about is what that transition was like, moving from very narrative focused games to this now kind of expansive RPG thing you got going.
Definitely. So that was a transition that I had been wanting to make for some time. And it's probably something that I should mention that many of the narrative designers at Telltale had worked on games that weren't just Telltale games in the past. And many mechanics were brought up in a lot of those Telltale games to potentially go in, other than just the narrative mechanics. So even while I was working at Telltale, I did a lot of work on things that maybe didn't make it into the final games, usually for production reasons. Like, I don't know if I need to go into the whole story about how things went down at Telltale, but lots of things went down. Also, I'm somebody who I grew up playing RPGs. Like, I was a huge Dungeons and Dragons fan, still am. Tabletop RPGs. I love the Baldur's Gate games. I've played pretty much everything BioWare has ever put out. So being able to sink my teeth into something like this has just been delightful. There are definitely extra challenges beyond something like a Telltale game because obviously the focus in Waylanders is more on combat and not necessarily on talking to your party members, although that does affect the story and the gameplay a lot too. But it's been just delightful sinking my teeth into that and getting to work with the rest of the team on making everything come together.
So you get to go back to the roots of things that you loved in the past, which is great. Congratulations. Way to go. And I have to ask, and I'm sure that was, it sounds like almost like a relief in a way that you get to kind of go back to your own personal roots, but with your great storytelling background as well.
Yeah, I would say so. Definitely. It's nice to be able to have more mechanics at your disposal.
What was that shift like, going from doing stuff like Batman and The Walking Dead and Guardians to now Celtic mythology fantasy?
It's definitely a different type of research. So when I was working on things like Batman and The Walking Dead, you go to the comics source material, you watch the films, you play other games, you watch the television shows, you take in as much as you can to really understand the spirit of the IP. And I'm lucky that many of the IP I got to work on at Telltale, I was already a huge fan of. I've been pretty vocal about having been a, Batman fan all of my life. But I've also always been really into European history. My minor in university was medieval and Renaissance studies. So in a lot of ways, this felt like a coming home too. But the type of research I'm doing here is, reading old Celtic poems. And the part that was the most exciting for me, actually going to ruins in Galicia, Spain with the team.
Oh, dude, you actually got to do that?
Oh yeah,
That's
there are a
awesome.
number of levels in the game that are actual places you can go and visit in Spain right now. They're still there. It's real. Even the main city, Brigantia, that you go to is Coruña, where the studio is based. So this wasn't just reading books to see what would work. It was talking to people in the city to learn about their local myths and legends, going and seeing plaques, sites, like putting my hands in the dirt, feeling what the rain felt like, because it's super rainy in that part of Spain. Yeah, it was extremely hands-on research, and I hope that every writer who gets to write about a culture they're part of or not a part of gets to do something like that in their life. It was just exquisite. There was this one thing that I got to do with the team in Coruña that I'm not completely sure how we're going to integrate it into the game yet, but there's a drink, an alcoholic drink in that part of Spain that's said to be tied to witches' magic. And there's like a 30-minute long chant that they do at the bar as they're making it, and then they light it on fire and like spoon it out with a ladle as it's still on fire and pass it out to everyone in the bar. And I got to go do that with everyone, and we're using it as fodder for the game. So that was a very long answer to your question, but
no, it was brilliant. It's amazing. I could just feel like the enthusiasm coming through. And as for that witchcraft drink, however you refer to it, I would sit there for 30 minutes in a game and listen to that chant, and that thing happened. So that sounds incredible. You mentioned earlier kind of evoking modern or a modern way of speaking. What is that process like, trying to modernize that language?
Absolutely. So when I first started writing for this game, I used the more traditional kind of fantasy speak. Everything sounded like that kind of fake high old English that we're used to hearing because Tolkien did it, and then every other fantasy property started doing it. That's what's in most other modern RPGs. But then I kind of was brought back to some of my own roots of how I got into working in video games. I came up in fan fiction, and so many people who are really passionate about things like BioWare games, things like Bethesda games, they read and write a ton of that type of material. And I don't want to say that we Tumblrified the game, because that's bananas, but I want to appeal to not just hardcore older RPG fans with the story of the game. A lot of the themes that we're touching on are modern. They're things that still touch people today. Like I said, even the sets are things you can still go to today, and the whole theme is about, connecting different time periods. So I wanted to make this feel accessible. I wanted to make it feel fresh, so that if someone picked this up and this was their first RPG ever and they were looking to romance a werewolf, they'd have a fun time, and it would be closer to something they might hear on TV. It took some iterations to get it right, and I think there are still some edits I want to make to kind of work on that voice, but it's been a fun challenge, and I hope people enjoy it.
Some of the key things you've mentioned that really stand out to me is that it's high fantasy from what it sounds like, but still rooted in genuine mythology and history. Yeah. But you're also trying to stray away from fantasy cliches or the fantasy tropes we're all familiar with because of Tolkien and all that jazz, while doing this modern twist in it. So it sounds like a telling commitment of trying to change, or at least just trying to create something genuinely new. So there's just a lot of moving parts and systems there that I find amazing. And also, how do you romance a werewolf?
I guess you'll find out. So the werewolves in this game, because you said something about werewolves earlier. They're a little different than the traditional werewolves that you see because they're based more out of Celtic mythology. Instead of humans who, turn into a wolf under the full moon and lose all their ability to do anything but hunt, like you see a lot of the time, these werewolves are werewolf all of the time. They are born a werewolf, they will die a werewolf. They're descendants of the great wolf god Lugh, who actually is someone you meet in our game very early on, within the first hour or so. And some of them are just wolves who have the intelligence of humans. And you have a party member who is on that side of the spectrum. And then others are almost entirely human looking, who have some of the skill and traits of wolves. And you can play as one of those kinds of werewolves. They live in camps outside the city. You get to visit the camp. They're cool. I like them.
Sweet.
They howl a lot.
They sound super cool.
Yeah.
Also, was there? I know you mentioned for some reason I don't know why I'm so fixated on the werewolf part of it. You mentioned there weren't elves. Is there any other standout, maybe not typical fantasy trope class that you're really excited about that's in this game?
There are 3, actually. So the first one would be the Trashnose, or the Goblins. Goblins in
like Trashnose,
Celtic
that's a good
lore,
name.
Right, Trashnose? They are small creatures who like to play pranks on people. They don't speak. They make jingly music noises, and they just basically mess with people to entertain themselves. And you eventually get one as a party member in our game. There's also the Mauryans, who are giant cannibalistic cyclopses. So that's fun. There's one of them in your party, and you'll meet a bunch of them. They live underground in a very cramped place full of lava and perpetual screaming, and eat each other because that's all they have.
Can you romance all of these? Okay? Can I romance? No, because I'm just like, can I get all up?
Can you romance a cannibal? Yes, you can.
Sweet. I'm gonna go and get a witchcraft drink, have them serenade me for 30 minutes, and then I'm gonna go and find my cannibal cyclops pal and hang out with a trash nose and a werewolf.
I think you're starting to get the tone of this game.
I know. I think I'm starting to already feel it. So okay, that's perfect.
The last of our specialty races would be the Mauryans, and they're also based off of Celtic lore. We didn't invent any of these. These all came out of, the myths and legends and history. The Mauryans live underground. They have gold eyes, and they're immortal. They also tend to trend towards being magic users, and they have their entirely separate society from what's going on the surface. So this might sound a little bit like dwarves, but they're not short. They tend to be tall and darker skinned and elegant, and extremely rich. They're cool. You get to meet one of them in the first scene, named Nazeja, who's one of the main characters in the game.
That's incredible. So something else I wanted to touch on is the idea of the span in time, and kind of how that works, or what that concept is. If you could explain to me, I understand, is it 1,000? It's 1,000 years between these things, or how does the time work in this game?
Yeah, it's around 1,000 years. So the idea is, very early on in the game, something happens to your character. I won't go into a ton of detail because I don't want to spoil everything. And also, some of those cutscenes aren't in the game yet. We are in early access. It's not finished. Some of the story is not going to make total sense yet. Something happens to your character where you get disconnected from time. And this is relatively important because there are people, including that character I mentioned, Nazeja, who are supposed to be able to see throughout time. People can see the future and see the past, but you don't exist in the timeline anymore, which means you can mess with it. So you can time jump between Celtic times and medieval times in order to try and solve some of the overall mysteries that are going on in the game. And this provides us a way to look a lot at what was happening in European culture at the time. A lot changed in Spain between, the year 0 and like 1300 AD. A lot changed. Like when this game starts out, there's no Christianity anywhere in Europe yet. But of course, when you do the time jump, you're in full-on Catholic Spain. So things are really, really different. But we're running with the idea that the Celtic world was real, because this is based off the myths and legends. So some of your party members are immortal, which means when you time skip more than 1,000 years into the future, they're still
They'll
there.
be there.
They'll be there. And some of your other party members reincarnate. So when you time skip, they're not there, but their soul is, and it's in somebody else. So how do you find them to get them to help you on your journey?
This is a lot, and like in a good way. Like it sounds
Okay,
like
good.
no, it's in a good. Like it's not. It's like it's very easy. Like I'm excited over the ideas of it. Is this something like a player could? Is it time jumping something required for a player? Can we go through time as is, or is this something we're put into a position to have to do to progress in certain ways?
You're going to need to time jump in order to progress in certain ways. In order to solve the main plot line, you have to spend time in both eras. The first act is entirely in the Celtic era. Second act is when you start to open up the medieval as well. And
Got it.
then we'll highly encourage people to go back and forth, because I want them to see everything cool that we put in this game.
Right.
But also they're going to have to solve some of the puzzles.
I mean, yeah, that's the nature of it.
You're not going to be able
but
to
it sounds
just play
awesome.
one.
I love that idea. The and going off and speaking in early access, what is that like for you as someone who's heavily, pushing the narrative and story of this game, and putting it in the hands to help you kind of develop that? Is this something you had to do in the past, and how does this differ from maybe ideas you had that may change because of early access? I don't know how that works.
Mm-hmm. This is the first time I've worked on an early access title, so that's a little bit new and different for me. But at the same time, when I worked at Telltale, we released the episodes one at a time. When we released episode 1, for example, that was usually around the time that episode 4 was just starting production. So if there was response to the earlier episodes, we could course correct later ones, or listen to what people were doing, what they liked, what they didn't like, any choices that had 90% of people going one way. Maybe those weren't the best ones to base later things in the games off of, because you'd be making content for only 10% of people, which is a really expensive decision. So that is not super new to me. The main part of early access that has been a transition has been, like I mentioned, we're missing cutscenes in a lot of places. So there are parts of the story that just don't make sense right now. And then people are like, wow, the story doesn't make sense. And I'm like, you are correct. That is accurate. I'm so sorry. We're in early access. We're going to fix it. But it's nice to know I can fix it. It's not just out there and it's a known shippable that's, done. There's time to iterate on the game and listen to feedback and make changes if things really aren't working. And that is so valuable.
This sounds great. I want to go romance, trash nose. I want to go time jump. I want to find people who are reincarnating themselves or being reincarnated into different bodies over time. It overall just sounds like a relief to hear an RPG fantasy that's trying to at least pivot in different directions. So, Emily, can't wait for it. I'm very excited about it. But unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today. So this is that moment in which you get to tell us, we already know it's an early access, but where can we get it? What can we expect? And is there a time in the future that we can maybe think of time jumping to in which the game will be officially out?
Absolutely. So right now, the game is exclusively on Steam as an early access title. Please go buy it or add it to your wish list. Consider taking a look at it. We just dropped a new patch that includes a dungeon you can play endlessly the other day, so that's fun. We don't have a timeline for exactly when the full game is going to be out yet, but we are adding patches regularly with new content and bug fixes, so it's improving rapidly. And stay tuned for when we'll know the full release.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Emily, for your time. Truly, it's been an honor. And for everything Waylanders and everything coming up, stay here at GameSpot. Thanks, folks.
Thank you.